Hey, I'm Amanda, mom, doula, childbirth educator, and birth nerd. Welcome to Let's Talk Birth, the podcast where we get into real birth stories, talk through the awkward stuff, and cover the things nobody told you about. So, grab your raspberry leaf tea, get comfy, and let's talk birth. Welcome. This is Let's Talk Birth. I am your host, Amanda. I want to welcome you to the very first episode. I'm so excited, a little nervous, but nervous excited. I just love birth. I love talking about it. I love educating people on it. I love dispelling fear, especially. That is one of my biggest things. I will get to that soapbox later, though. I feel myself getting ready for it, and that's probably just because I'm caffeinated. So first of all, I want to say whether you are expecting your first baby or your seventh or anywhere in between, if you're trying to conceive, if you're not even at that stage in life or you're way past that stage in life, welcome. This is exactly the place for you, and I'm very excited that you're here. In this podcast, we're going to listen to real parents tell their raw birth stories. I will have friends, myself, family, even you, tell your birth stories on this podcast. If there's one thing I know that happens to so many pregnant women is, unfortunately, people can't help but trauma dump their traumatic births onto these women. And that sucks. Because then this first-time mom is going into her birth terrified. And let me tell you this, the last thing you need when you're in labor is to be afraid. Fear brings pain. Fear causes contractions to hurt more. Fear causes your body to slow down in labor, and not in a good way. There are so many reasons that you shouldn't be afraid in labor, especially if you want to have an unmedicated birth. But we'll get to that in a later episode. One of the reasons why I'm having so many families come on this podcast and tell their real raw birth stories is to combat that with birth stories of medicated labor that went great, unmedicated labor that went great, fear-free births, and even a couple pain-free births. Yes, unmedicated pain-free births. Another goal for this podcast is to talk about the taboo things. We are going to talk about miscarriage and vanishing twin syndrome and other things that people don't like to talk about because they're either scary or maybe even embarrassing. There is shame that's attached to them, and there is undealt with grief that happens a lot because people think that they're alone in this. And because of that, I'm going to combat that as well by bringing light to it and having people talk about it, having people share their stories, share my own stories. Don't worry, I will give content warnings for the more sensitive topics because I myself have been triggered by a story that hit too close to home too soon. But these things need to be talked about, so that's what we're going to do. One of the other goals of Let's Talk Birth is to talk about and answer the questions that you might be too embarrassed to ask. The awkward questions that when you go into your appointment, you're totally planning on asking your provider what a mucus plug looks like or how you actually know that you're in labor, but it's the kind of thing that is either too gross that you don't want to bring up or might be too embarrassing, like maybe you should have known this before. Don't be embarrassed. Submit your questions in the link in the show notes and we will address them. And by we, I'm talking about myself and my sister Kirsten, who is actually also a doula. We will have full episodes where we answer your questions without judgment and completely anonymous. Okay, so now that we've talked about what to expect from the podcast, let's talk about me a little bit, give you a little introduction to who I am, why I do what I do, and why I started this podcast. Like I said before, my name's Amanda. I have a 6-year-old, 3.5-year-old, and a 4-month-old. So aside from being a mom, I'm also a doula and childbirth educator. I founded my business, Deep Roots Birthwork, a few years ago and have been attending births and educating and supporting parents ever since. I'm also a birth nerd who believes that birth doesn't have to be this big, scary thing that you have to be intimidated by. And lastly, I believe that birth is birth is birth. Whether it be in a car on the side of the road on your way to the hospital, at home in a birth tub, on an operating table, medicated, unmedicated, birth is birth. And there is no shame in the way that you birth ever. Whether you want to have a completely unmedicated free birth at home with nobody there, or you go into birth thinking, knock me out and wake me up when the baby's here. There is no judgment and no shame. I just want to make sure that you are making educated decisions so you feel confident going into your birth. and fear has no place in the birthing space. I've seen so many people afraid of birth, and there's so much misinformation and trauma sharing without consent, by the way. I want to demystify birth. It doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. You don't have to be afraid. I wanted to create a space that brings birth back to what it really should be. Something that's powerful, instinctual, and absolutely achievable. Birth is transformational and deserves guidance and respect, not fear. As you can tell, I'm passionate about educating and equipping parents to feel confident and informed when it comes to their labor. I love supporting families through such a huge life transition. I mean, birth is so incredible. And let me tell you what, if you've ever been to a wedding and you see the bride coming down the aisle and you whip around and look at the groom and see that face that he makes, the awe, the shock, the love that he has for his bride, let me tell you this. One of my favorite parts about birth, about being a doula, is seeing my friends become dads. Seeing the look on his face when he just saw the love of his life birth their child. It's incredible. Birth is beautiful. It does not have to be scary. Now, you may be asking, Amanda, why do you have such strong opinions about birth aside from being a birth doula? Why did you become a birth doula? I'm happy you ask. Let me get into the story of my first birth because transformational doesn't even begin to describe how that birth went. Let me just say that. I didn't know much about birth. I knew I wanted to try to have a natural labor, and by natural I mean unmedicated. And that was just about it. And when I say unmedicated, all I knew is that you can have an epidural. I didn't know about all of the other stuff, all of the other medications, all of the non-pharmaceutical pain relief options. I didn't know about that. I didn't know that they existed. I didn't want to have an unmedicated birth in the way that I refused to have any kind of medication. I just wanted to see how far I could make it, if I could do it, if this was something that was achievable for me. Now, when I found out that I was pregnant, I talked with my mom about our medical insurance because, yes, I was still on my parents' medical insurance. And they looked into it and it just wasn't going to cover a home birth. So that was fine. I was open-handed about it. Okay, cool. I'll have a hospital birth and just try not to give in to the desire to have medication. So fast forward to 34 weeks, I ended up finding out about a midwife team that does payment plans and would work with us. And so at 34 weeks, we switched over from an OBGYN in a hospital to a team of midwives at home. Now, something to note is I did test GBS positive, and the one thing that my midwives did tell me is because they don't have the ability to do an IV, if my water breaks, I need to have the baby within 24 hours or we would need to transfer to a hospital so I can get some antibiotics to prevent any kind of infection. Okay, cool. Don't let my water break first. Awesome. Only 11% of births actually start with the water breaking, so that's totally fine. Well, at 35 weeks, at my sister's wedding, I start having contractions. Now, at the time, I didn't know they were what's called prodromal labor contractions, which is different than Braxton Hicks contractions. Another thing that it's called is false labor. I hate that term. We don't use that term on this podcast because, if anything, false labor is super invalidating. Those things hurt. And what typically happens, and I know because I've now had prodromal labor with all 3 of my pregnancies, is you'll start having contractions and they'll get pretty regular or not, but they stay pretty regular and don't increase at all. And then by the time you wake up the next morning, they're gone. And then typically you can start up again. And like I said, every birth is different. Every body is different. So it might not be the same from pregnancy to pregnancy. Anyway, at 35 weeks at my sister's wedding, I'm on the phone in a closet, trying not to freak out, talking to my midwives. They calm me down. They give me a couple tips. Contractions slow down a little bit, and I try to relax for the rest of the evening. The next morning, contractions were done. They weren't there anymore. So we knew, okay, this is prodromal labor. We're okay. So when 37 weeks comes around and I start having contractions again, I'm thinking, this is it. This can totally be it. It's not common for the first baby to come early, but this is my baby and he's coming early. And that's totally fine. I'm excited. Awesome. What happens? My midwife comes over, spends the night, no contractions by morning. okay, we'll just keep an eye on it. And if it actually starts to kick in next time, then we'll call the midwife. At this point, I am a people pleaser. I am all up in my head and I'm freaking out because I keep thinking I'm crying wolf, and my midwife is probably texting all of her midwife friends like, oh, silly Amanda, she thought she was in labor again, which, just so you know, was not the case. And even though I knew that it wasn't the case, it still felt like that just because I was so in my head about it. On the day before my due date, my water breaks at 10 p.m., which is important to note because I only had 24 hours from that point to have my baby, or else I would have to transfer to the hospital, which was so not the plan. I was going to be okay with it, theoretically, but emotionally I was not okay with it. I put all this pressure on myself from that point on in my labor, and that was not the thing to do. In the moment, I thought, this is fine. I'm fine. We're going to do this. I'm going to power through, and I'm going to will this baby to come out within 24 hours, which is crazy. But I was a first-time mom, and I didn't know any better. By the time about 6 p.m. came around, my midwife said that they were going to go to dinner and come back in a couple hours. So they gave me this herbal concoction thing that I took to hopefully help contractions get stronger in active labor to start. And good news, it did. I was fully in active labor while they were at dinner. Now, I don't know if they know this, but my mom, my mother-in-law, my sister, and a friend of mine who was going to be our birth photographer were all supposed to be at that birth. They were being given updates every couple hours. It wasn't time for them to come yet just because I didn't want them waiting around a lot. I mean, I already had 2 midwives and a student midwife in my living room, just in my mind, twiddling their thumbs and wondering, when is she going to have this baby? So I really didn't need 4 additional people just waiting for me to finally have this kid. But because I put this pressure on myself to perform, I was so stressed out, and I really didn't need to be. There was a point that my husband looked at me and verbalized what I needed to hear. He said, you don't want to invite anyone else to come, do you? And as soon as he said that, there was this huge relief. I started crying and I told him, no, I don't want to invite anyone else. I want them to be there, yeah, but I'm already feeling so pressured. By this time, it's probably 7 o'clock at night. I have 3 hours to have this baby and I'm nowhere near that. I mean, the average first-time mom takes 4 hours to push. I only just started active labor. I felt like I was disappointing myself, I was disappointing my midwives, and I was disappointing my husband, where in reality, none of that was the case. At about 8 o'clock that night, my midwives came back and they had a plan. While they were at dinner, they primarily left so then they could plot and plan and scheme and try to figure out how we can have this baby at our apartment instead of a hospital. So what did they do? They contacted another midwife in the area who was able to do IVs and give me IV antibiotics. So honestly, at that point, I was so relieved. There was now no longer this ticking time bomb counting down until 10 o'clock. And instead, I really got to lean into labor and partner with my body. Sometime during the night, we don't know if it was his positioning or my positioning, but Jacob just started really not liking some of the contractions. So they had me lay down and he started enjoying that position. So we labored in that position for a while. At about 4 a.m., I started experiencing the fetal ejection reflex. I had a contraction that felt a little different, and I remember saying, I think I'm pushing, and yeah, I was pushing. They started filling up the birth tub, and I got in, and when I tell you there is a reason that water is called the midwife epidural, that is why. It was incredible. I wish I had been laboring in the tub the entire time. I was pushing in the tub for about 45 minutes before he started crowning, and at that point, the midwives had determined that they really couldn't get a good reading on his heart, and because he had dipped in his heart rate earlier in the labor, they really felt more comfortable, and I agreed, if we moved onto the bed. So with their help, I got onto the foot of the bed and started crawling to the head of the bed where they had laid up this throne space for me to push in. As I was on my hands and knees crawling to the head of the bed, about halfway up the bed, I ended up getting another contraction and couldn't help myself. I started to push again. And at that point, my midwife, who is the sweetest, most soft-spoken person you'll ever know, and she probably didn't sound like this in reality, but in my head, it sounded like she was ordering me like a drill sergeant. She said, Amanda, if you're going to push right now, you need to push that baby out. So I did. I bared down, and in one push, he went from crowning to plop down on the bed. And that was it. He was born. My Jacob was here and my labor was done. And let me tell you, I felt so powerful. I felt so strong and amazing and feminine. And after that experience, I realized even though I am the queen of researching, I was in no way prepared for labor. And that's not my midwife's fault. That's not their job. Midwives are not doulas. Midwives are not childbirth educators. Their job is the medical side of things. They're there to make sure that you're physically okay and that the baby is physically okay. That is their primary goal. But I didn't know that. I thought that a doula would do exactly what my midwives did, which was to kind of support me during labor. They were amazing. I've used them every single time I've had a baby and will continue to use them. But that's not their job. Their job is not to squeeze my hips or to suggest different positions for pain management or to rub my back or bring me water. Their jobs are to make sure that my heart is still beating and so is my baby's. So after having Jacob, after having my firstborn, I realized because I was so underprepared, even though I prepared so much, after experiencing my own labor and knowing friends who experienced labor before I did and how theirs went, I knew that there was a piece missing. Even after all the research I did, I had no idea what to expect. And from that moment on, you could ask any of my friends, any of my family, I could not stop talking about labor because I knew how much of a mystery it was to everyone else. I knew I wanted to be a doula. I knew I wanted to be in the birth industry. I knew I wanted to support moms and help them become parents and help them feel what I felt when I gave birth to my son. So that's why I'm doing what I do. That's why I became a childbirth educator and why I became a doula, why I have this podcast. Because if I can do it, you can do it. Something else that I learned from my first birth is emotional support is just as important as physical support when it comes to labor. In my labor with Jacob, the conversation that I had with my husband was so important to have when we talked about not inviting anyone else because I was so emotionally distraught and putting so much pressure on myself already that as soon as that pressure was lifted, my contractions really started being powerful. If there's anything I want you to take away from this episode, it's that birth doesn't have to feel scary, and you were made for this. I want you to know that this podcast is a safe place to learn, explore, ask questions, and prepare for birth. With that, there's actually a couple things I would love to invite you in on. If you have any questions that you'd like answered, I want to hear it. I want to help you. I want to give you the answer. There's a link in the show notes where you can send your questions with no judgment, and no topic is too awkward, I promise. Something else I want to share with you is I actually have a free ebook called 5 Steps to a Fear-Free Birth. It's packed with simple mindset shifts and tips to help you feel calm and in control in your labor. So if you feel like that resonates with you, go grab it. You can find it linked in the show notes too. I want to say thank you so much for joining me today while I talked about my birth with my son and my thought process behind this podcast and why I'm doing it and why I do what I do. I feel so honored that you're here, and I would love for you to join me in the next episode. Make sure that you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You can also sign up for email notifications so you know when the next one comes out. And this is a new podcast. I would love it and be so honored if you leave a quick review to help other moms find the show. And also share the show. If you have a friend who's pregnant or looking to be pregnant soon, share it with them so they can learn right alongside you. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to see you on the next episode of Let's Talk Birth.